The grant application had been denied twice before it was approved. Not because the research question was considered unimportant. The question of why humans slept the way they slept had been a minor thread in xenobiological research since Earth's conclave membership began, and had produced a small but consistent body of literature that the field considered adequately developed, which was the polite scientific way of saying that enough work had been done to establish what was known, and that the unknown remainder was not sufficiently interesting to justify major funding. Dr. Valith Thessaly had read the existing literature 3 times before she submitted her first application. The existing literature said, humans spend approximately 1/3 of their lives in a state of reduced consciousness. During this state, biological maintenance functions occur, memory consolidation processes are active, and the brain produces complex narrative experiences that humans call dreams. The state is required for normal cognitive and physiological function. Deprivation produces degraded performance and, in extreme cases, death. The existing literature said these things accurately. It did not say what Thessaly had noticed, which was that none of these things were unusual. Biological maintenance during rest states was universal. Memory consolidation was documented in most complex cognitive species. Complex experiences during low consciousness states existed in at least 4 other species in the conclave's research archive. What the existing literature did not explain was why human sleep was so dramatically different from all of those. Not in its function, in its texture. Thessaly had been a comparative xenobiologist for 21 years. She had studied rest states across 16 species. She knew what rest looked like. She knew what the biological signatures of maintenance and consolidation looked like. She knew what the neural activity patterns of complex resting experiences looked like. Human sleep looked like all of those things. It also looked like something else that she did not have a category for. The first grant denial said, the proposed research duplicates existing literature, insufficient justification for new investigation. She had read the denial and had spent 3 weeks reading the existing literature again, looking for what she was missing. She was not missing anything. The literature said what it said, and what it said was accurate, and what it said was incomplete in a way she could not yet articulate well enough to put in a grant application. She tried to articulate it better. The second application said, existing literature characterizes human sleep by its functions, and by comparison to rest states in other species. The proposed research will investigate human sleep on its own terms, without the comparative framework, to determine whether the existing characterization captures the full phenomenon. The second denial said, the proposed research lacks a specific hypothesis. Research should be directed toward answering a defined question rather than investigating a phenomenon without a predicted outcome. Thessaly had read the second denial and had thought about it for a long time. The problem was that she did not have a hypothesis. She had an instinct. The instinct said that something was happening in human sleep that the existing literature had not found because the existing literature had been looking for what it expected to find and had found it and had stopped looking. She could not put an instinct in a grant application. She tried to turn the instinct into a hypothesis. The third application said, human sleep, when analyzed without the comparative framework of other species' rest states, will reveal characteristics that are qualitatively distinct from those documented in existing literature. The proposed research hypothesizes that human sleep serves functions beyond those currently characterized, and that these functions are detectable through extended longitudinal observation of a representative human subject. The third application was approved. It was approved narrowly by 1 vote on the review committee, and the approval came with a notation that said, the hypothesis is underspecified, and the research design is exploratory rather than confirmatory. Funding is approved for an initial 18-month period contingent on preliminary findings that justify continuation. Thessaly had read the approval and had felt the specific feeling of someone who has been given permission to do the thing they knew needed to be done, and who is now facing the reality of doing it. She had begun recruiting subjects. The subject selection process took 4 months. Thessaly had developed criteria that she could defend scientifically while also acknowledging to herself that the criteria were shaped by the instinct that had produced the research in the first place. She needed humans who were willing to sleep in a laboratory environment for extended periods, who could tolerate significant monitoring without disruption to their normal sleep patterns, and who were, in the language of the selection criteria, cognitively representative of the general human population. What she was actually looking for, and what she could not write in the selection criteria, was humans who seemed to her, on the basis of pre-selection interviews, to be fully human in a way that she found difficult to define, but that she recognized when she saw it. She selected 8 subjects. The subjects represented a range of ages, backgrounds, and occupations: a retired engineer, a musician, a physician, a former military logistics officer, a teacher, a writer, a marine biologist, a professional athlete. What they had in common, beyond what the selection criteria specified, was that each of them had, in the pre-selection interview, said something that had made Thessaly stop and write it down. Not because the things they said were extraordinary, because the things they said were ordinary in a way that she had not expected. The engineer had said, when asked to describe her relationship with sleep, "It is the part of the day when things get sorted. I do not know how else to describe it. Things go in and they are one way and they come out and they are different. I trust it." The musician had said, "I compose more when I am asleep than when I am awake. I do not choose to, it happens. I keep a notebook by the bed." The physician had said, "I make better diagnoses after I sleep on a case. There is something about the non-directed processing. I have learned not to trust my pre-sleep conclusions on complex cases." The military logistics officer had said, "Sleep is how I know what I actually think about a problem as opposed to what I think. The difference is significant." The teacher had said, "My students ask me sometimes how I know when a lesson is wrong when the approach is not working. I tell them that I know when I have slept on it. Before sleep I have theories. After sleep I have knowledge. I do not know why." The writer had said, "The work happens at night, not me at a desk. The work happening while I am not watching. I just have to be there in the morning to write it down." The marine biologist had said, "I dream in solutions. I am not exaggerating. I have woken up with the answer to problems I did not know I was working on." The professional athlete had said, "The difference between a good performance and a great one is almost always the sleep I got before it. Not the training, not the preparation, the sleep. Something integrates during sleep that the training produces the material for but cannot complete on its own." Thessaly had read these 8 responses after collecting them, and had felt the instinct sharpen into something closer to a question. The question was, what is actually happening? The study began on a Monday. The 8 subjects slept in the laboratory's monitoring suite for 5 nights per week over an initial period of 12 weeks. The monitoring equipment was the most sophisticated available for non-invasive neural observation. Thessaly had arranged access to equipment that was normally used for research on species, with significantly more complex monitoring requirements, and had adapted it for human subjects with the help of a technical specialist who had expressed skepticism about the research question, and whose skepticism Thessaly had treated as an asset because skeptics asked better questions than believers. The first 4 weeks produced data. The data said, in the language of the analysis tools, what the existing literature had said: biological maintenance, memory consolidation, complex resting experiences. The signatures were clear and consistent across all 8 subjects and consistent with the published literature. Thessaly read the data and felt the instinct say, "Keep looking." She kept looking. In the 5th week, she noticed something. She noticed it in the data from the writer, who was designated Subject 6 in the study records, and who had the most active resting experience signatures of the 8 subjects. The signature was not unusual in its type. Complex resting experiences produced the neural signature type she was seeing. What was unusual was the timing. The signature preceded the content. Not by much, by fractions of a second, but in the timing data, which the equipment resolved with sufficient precision to make the fraction of a second visible, the signature that indicated the brain was producing complex experiential content appeared before the content that Thessaly could observe in the neural activity patterns. She looked at the data again. She ran the analysis again. The fraction of a second held. She ran it for the other subjects. 6 of the 8 showed the same pattern. The brain was doing something before it produced the content of the complex resting experience, not generating the content, something prior to the generation. She called the technical specialist. The specialist looked at the data. He said, "This could be a measurement artifact." She said, "I know, check it." He checked it. The measurement artifact explanation did not hold. The timing was real. He said, "What is the brain doing in the interval?" She said, "That is the question." He said, "How long is the interval?" She said, "Variable across subjects, across sessions, but consistently present." He said, "What kind of processing produces a signature before the content it is processing?" She said, "I do not know. That is why I need you to help me understand what we are looking at." He said, "I have not seen this in any other species." She said, "No, neither have I." He said, "Which means?" She said, "Which means it is either an artifact or it is something we do not have a category for." He said, "You have checked for artifact." She said, "You have checked for artifact." He said, "Yes." She said, "And?" He said, "It is not an artifact." She said, "Then we do not have a category for it." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "What is in the interval?" She said, "That is the second question." The second question took 8 weeks to begin answering. The 8 weeks involved developing new analysis protocols, because the existing protocols had not been designed to look at what was in the interval. The interval was too brief for the standard protocols to resolve. The technical specialist developed a modified approach that sacrificed breadth for resolution and was able, by week 12 of the study, to produce a rudimentary picture of what was happening in the fractions of a second before the complex resting experience content appeared. The picture was not clean. It was a partial picture assembled from indirect indicators and inference, but it was a picture. The picture showed that in the interval, the brain was doing something that the existing literature had not described, and that the analysis tools had not been designed to detect. The brain was searching, not for content, not for the narrative material of the complex resting experience, for something prior to content, for something that the brain appeared to need before it could generate content, something that the available analysis tools could characterize only as a query, a question the brain was asking before it produced the experience. Thessaly looked at the picture. She looked at it for a long time. She said to the technical specialist, when he came to review it with her, "It is asking something." He said, "The brain." She said, "In the interval, before the experience, the brain is asking something." He said, "Asking what?" She said, "That is the third question." He said, "Can we determine what it is asking?" She said, "Not with the current tools. The resolution is not sufficient to characterize the content of the query. We can see that there is a query. We cannot see what the query is." He said, "What would you need to see what the query is?" She said, "Better tools." He said, "We have the best tools available." She said, "Then we need tools that do not exist yet." He said, "That is not a timeline that fits the 18-month funding window." She said, "I know." She wrote the preliminary findings report. The preliminary findings report described the interval and the measurement verification and the partial picture of the query, and what it meant that the brain was doing something in the fractions of a second before the complex resting experience that the existing literature had not described, and that the available tools could not fully characterize. She submitted the report to the funding committee with a continuation request. The continuation request said, "The preliminary findings identify a previously undocumented phenomenon in human sleep that requires further investigation with enhanced resolution tools. The phenomenon cannot be explained by the existing literature. The investigation is at an early stage, and the full characterization of the phenomenon requires continued funding." The committee read the report. The committee requested a presentation. She presented. She presented the interval data and the measurement verification and the partial picture and what she knew and what she did not know, and why what she did not know was the most important thing in the report. The committee asked questions. The committee asked the questions that committees asked when they had received findings that did not fit the existing framework and were deciding whether the findings were real or the analysis was wrong. They asked about methodology and calibration and measurement artifact, and whether existing explanations had been fully exhausted. She answered every question. The committee deliberated. The committee approved continuation funding for 2 years. The continuation approval said, "The preliminary findings are unusual and require replication and further investigation. Continuation is approved on the condition that the research team produces a replication of the interval phenomenon in an independent sample of subjects and develops a theoretical framework for what the phenomenon might represent before the 2-year period ends." She read the continuation approval. She began recruiting the independent replication sample. She also began thinking about the theoretical framework. The theoretical framework was harder than the replication. The replication was a practical problem. She knew how to run the study. She knew what to look for. She recruited 12 new subjects, ran the monitoring, found the interval in 10 of the 12, verified the measurement, and submitted the replication finding at month 8 of the continuation period. The theoretical framework required her to say what the brain was doing and why, and she did not know what the brain was doing and she did not know why. And saying things she did not know in a theoretical framework was the part of science that she found most difficult because the saying required more confidence than the knowing, and she did not have the confidence. She had the instinct. She had the 8 pre-selection interview responses. She had the partial picture of the query. She had the data from 20 months of monitoring 8 subjects sleeping, and in the course of 20 months of monitoring, she had accumulated the secondary data that every study accumulated when it ran long enough. The data that was not the primary measurement, but that existed around the primary measurement, and that sometimes said things the primary measurement did not. The secondary data was the subject's own accounts. She had been collecting them since month 1. Standard qualitative research practice. Weekly interviews with each subject about their experience of sleep, their dreams, what they remembered, what felt significant, what was confusing, what surprised them. She had been collecting the accounts and filing them, and had not analyzed them because the accounts were qualitative, and her primary interest was quantitative, and the qualitative accounts were in the methodology as a secondary measure, which meant they were there for completeness rather than for the answer. She pulled the accounts. She read 20 months of weekly accounts from 8 subjects. She read for 3 days. On the 3rd day, she called the technical specialist. She said, "Come and read these." He came. He read for 2 days. Then he came to her office and sat down. He said, "They all say the same thing." She said, "Yes." He said in different ways, different words, different contexts, different experiences. She said, but the same thing, yes. He said, they describe the sleep as working on something. She said, yes. He said, not as a passive state where things happen to them. She said, no. He said, as an active process that they are participating in even when they are not conscious of participating. She said, yes. He said, and the thing it is working on. She said, they cannot always say what the thing is, but they describe the product, the solution that was not there before sleep and was there after, the connection that formed, the decision that clarified, the thing they could not do before sleep and could do after. He said, the brain is working on problems during sleep. She said, the brain is working on problems that the conscious waking mind could not solve. Yes. He said, this is in the existing literature, memory consolidation, problem solving during sleep states. She said, it is in the existing literature as a description of what happens, not as a description of what it feels like to be the thing it is happening in. He said, and what does it feel like? She said, read the accounts. He said, I have read them. She said, what does it feel like? He was quiet for a moment. He said, it feels like the sleep is alive. She said, yes. He said, it feels like something is in there that has its own agenda. She said, yes. He said, something that the conscious mind does not control and does not fully know, but that is doing something with the purpose and the competence of something that knows what it is doing. She said, yes. He said, the engineer said she trusts it. She said, yes. He said, after a lifetime of being a person who is trained to trust verified data and controlled processes and evidence-based conclusions, she trusts this thing that she cannot see and does not control. She said, yes. He said, why does she trust it? She said, because it has been right. He said, right about what? She said, read the accounts again. He read the accounts again. He came back. He said, every subject describes a pattern. The sleep works on something. The sleep produces an output. The output is better than what the conscious mind had produced before the sleep. She said, consistently. He said, consistently across all 8 subjects, across 20 months of accounts. She said, yes. He said, and they have learned this from experience. She said, from a lifetime of experience, yes. He said, and so they trust it. She said, they trust a process they cannot see and do not control because the process has been producing better outputs than they can produce consciously for their entire lives. He said, and the query. He said, the interval, the fraction of a second before the experience, the brain asking something. She said, yes. He said, the brain is asking what to work on. She was quiet for a moment. She said, yes. She said, that is the hypothesis. He said, the brain, during sleep, asks itself what needs to be worked on and then works on it, and produces outputs that the conscious mind takes up in the morning. She said, and the process has been doing this for long enough that the subjects have learned to trust it. He said, for their entire lives. She said, for every human's entire life, since the beginning of human existence. He said, the query is the brain deciding what to do with the sleep. She said, the brain is managing its own processing in a way that the conscious mind is not involved in and cannot fully observe. He said, a second cognitive system. She said, operating during sleep, yes. He said, and the outputs. She said, are the solutions and the connections and the decisions that humans find waiting for them in the morning. He said that they did not put there. She said that the other system put there. He said, while they were not watching. She said, while they were not watching, yes. He was quiet for a long time. He said, this breaks the model. She said, yes. He said, the existing model says sleep is a state of reduced function that allows maintenance and consolidation. She said, yes. He said, the existing model does not include a second cognitive system with its own processing agenda that operates during sleep and produces outputs that the conscious mind uses when it returns. She said, no. He said, because no other species shows this. She said, the 16 species in my prior research have nothing like the interval, nothing like the accounts the subjects give, nothing like the trust the subjects describe. He said they just rest. She said they rest, yes. He said, and humans. She said, do not just rest. He said, what do they do? She said, they send in the other crew. He said, the other crew. She said, while the conscious mind is offline, a second system comes on and does the work the conscious mind could not do, works on the problems that daytime processing could not solve, makes the connections that the directed mind could not make, produces the outputs that the morning mind will take and use. He said, and then when the conscious mind comes back online. She said, the outputs are there. He said, as if someone else did the work. She said, because someone else did. He was quiet. He said, 1/3 of their lives. She said, yes. He said, they spend 1/3 of their lives with the other crew on. She said, yes. He said, working. She said, yes. He said, not resting. She said, in the physiological sense, resting. In the cognitive sense, working. He said, and the work the other crew does. She said, is the work that the daytime mind cannot do, the problems that require non-directed processing, the connections that require the relaxation of the constraints that directed thinking imposes, the solutions that emerge when the specific filter of conscious attention is removed. He said, the engineer said things go in and they come out different. She said, yes. He said, she is describing the handoff. She said, yes. He said, the conscious mind goes in with problems and the other crew processes them, and the conscious mind comes out with outputs. She said, yes. He said, and the other crew is asking what to work on. She said, in the interval, in the fraction of a second before the processing begins, yes. He said, it has a query. She said, yes. He said, and then it works. She said, yes. He said, for 1/3 of every human's life. She said, yes. He said, without the conscious mind knowing the full extent of what is happening. She said, the conscious mind knows something is happening, they trust it, they report it, but they cannot observe it directly. He said, they live with a cognitive partner they have never fully met. She said, that is one way to describe it, yes. He said, and the partner has been producing outputs for their entire lives. She said, yes. He said, and the partner is what produced. He stopped. She looked at him. He said, the partner is what produced the things that humans produce that we cannot explain. She said, explain. He said, the solutions that appear overnight, the sudden connections, the work that the writer does while asleep, the diagnoses the physician makes after sleeping on a case, the compositions the musician finds in the morning. He said, those are the partner's outputs. She said, yes. He said, and not just the obvious creative ones. She said, no. He said, the engineer's trust, the logistics officer's understanding of what she actually thinks, the teacher's knowledge of what is wrong with the lesson, the athlete's integration. She said, all of it. He said, all of it is the partner working. She said, and the partner has been working for every human who has ever existed. He said, for 1/3 of every life. She said, yes. He said, and we have been studying human cognition as if humans were one cognitive system. She said, as if the daytime mind was the whole mind. Yes. He said, and humans are too. She said, at minimum, yes. He was quiet for a long time. He said, "How do I write a theoretical framework for this?" She said carefully. He said, "The committee is going to have questions." She said, "Yes." He said, "The questions are going to be the same questions they asked in the presentation: methodology, calibration, artifact, alternative explanations." She said, "Yes." He said, "And the answers are going to be the same answers." She said, "Yes." He said, "And then they are going to ask whether we can verify the second system directly." She said, "And we are going to say that the current tools cannot resolve the interval content with sufficient precision to verify the system directly." He said, "And they are going to ask what would verify it." She said, "And we are going to describe the tools that do not exist yet." He said, "And they are going to ask how long it will take to develop those tools." She said, "And we are going to say that we do not know." He said, "And the funding?" She said, "The theoretical framework will need to be compelling enough that the committee believes the question is worth waiting for the tools." He said, "Is it?" She looked at the data. At 20 months of monitoring, at the interval, at the partial picture of the query, at the accounts of 8 subjects describing a lifetime of trusting a partner they had never fully met. She thought about 1/3 of every human life. She thought about the things humans produced that could not be explained by the daytime mind alone. She thought about the dark matter warships and the ancient fleet and the aperture technology, and the Foundation-class vessel, and the doctoral student who had written a margin note on a 9,000-year-old paper at 200 in the morning, and had found the question that changed everything. She thought about 200 in the morning. She thought about what was working at 200 in the morning, while the doctoral student was technically asleep. She said, "Yes." She said, "It is worth waiting for the tools." He said, "Because." She said, "Because humans are the most productive species in the conclave's history across every metric by which productivity can be measured. Because the output rate of human civilization exceeds projections based on the size and age of the civilization by factors that the models cannot explain. Because the things humans produce consistently exceed what should be producible by the measured parameters of human cognition." She said, "And the measured parameters of human cognition were measured on the daytime mind." She said, "There is another mind. It works 1/3 of every life. Its outputs are indistinguishable from the daytime mind's outputs because both go through the same hands to the same paper." She said, "But the accounting is wrong." He said, "The accounting." She said, "When we count what humans produce, we count what the daytime mind takes credit for. We do not count the partner's contribution separately because we did not know the partner existed." He said, "And if you count correctly?" She said, "If you count correctly, human cognitive productivity is not a mystery." He said, "It is 2 minds." She said, "Working across all of a human life." He said, "And we only knew about one of them." She said, "Until now." He said, "What do we call the second one?" She looked at the data. She thought about the engineer who said things go in and come out different, and I trust it. She thought about what you called something you trusted completely and had never fully met, and that had been doing the real work all along. She said, "The existing literature calls the complex experiences during sleep dreaming. The state is called sleep. The literature does not have a name for what I am describing because the literature did not know it existed." She said, "I do not want to name it yet." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because naming it will shape how the committee thinks about it, and how the subsequent literature thinks about it. And the name should be accurate to what it is, and I do not yet know enough to know what it is accurately enough to name it." She said, "I know what it does. I know the interval, I know the query, I know the outputs." She said, "I do not know what it is." He said, "And that is the question that needs the tools that do not exist yet." She said, "Yes." He said, "And we write the framework around the question." She said yes. He said, and hoped the committee believes the question is worth waiting for. She said yes. She began writing the framework. The framework was 42 pages. It described the interval and the query and the outputs and the accounts, and what the existing model missed, and what the corrected model said, and why the corrected model required verification by tools that did not currently exist, and why developing those tools was worth the investment. She submitted the framework with a request for continued funding. The committee read it. The committee requested a second presentation. She presented. She presented for 4 hours. The committee asked questions for 3 hours after the presentation. The committee deliberated. The committee approved funding for 5 years. The approval said, the theoretical framework presents a compelling case for a previously uncharacterized phenomenon in human cognition. The implications for the understanding of human cognitive productivity are significant. The committee approves continued funding with a mandate to develop the analytical tools required for direct verification of the proposed second cognitive system. She read the approval. She read the part that said the implications for the understanding of human cognitive productivity are significant. She thought about 1/3 of every human life. She thought about the partner. She thought about all the human things that the daytime mind had taken credit for that the partner had built. She thought about the doctoral student at 200. She thought about what the partner had been working on in the dark while the student slept. She thought about the margin note waiting on the desk in the morning. She thought about what it meant that the most significant question in the history of conclave physics had been worked on by a mind that the student did not fully know existed. She thought about 1/3 of every human life. She thought about the tools she needed to build. She began building them.